In his book, The Talent Code, Daniel Coyle describes a model of practice consisting of 4 steps. The first step is to pick a target. The second step is to reach for that target. The third step is to evaluate the gap between the reach and the target. And the fourth step is to go back to the first step, or to rinse and repeat, if you will. Now, I find this model of practice very useful and very practical. I like that it is so simple and so systematic. However, I want to focus in this presentation on an aspect that I think is often overlooked, and that is the role of setting and managing expectations when picking a target, when reaching for a target, and when evaluating that gap. In this presentation, I will explain what I mean with setting expectations and managing expectations. I will talk about why I think it's so important that string players especially are aware of this aspect of their playing and that they incorporate this in their practice routines. And I will give some of the pros of making a habit of setting positively and clearly defined expectations when practicing. At the end of the presentation, I will demonstrate 2 scenarios which will hopefully illustrate what I mean by all of this more clearly. So what do I mean with setting and managing expectations in practice? With this expectation, I specifically refer to the mindset we're in when picking a target and the sort of self-belief we have when reaching for that target. So if we think of the characteristics of a target worth aiming at, I think the first one for me is that it has to be positively defined. Now, it's easy to give an example of a negatively defined target. So let's say I want to play a shift and I'm thinking I don't want to make a scratchy sound. Now, that in itself is not a negative thing, but it would be much better to define this in a positive. For example, I want to play the shift with a sweet sound, or with a clear sound, or with a strident sound. So you might have noticed that when we define something positively, it automatically adds a level of detail and precision. And that's very important. It means that we can be much more specific in our target, and that helps us to imagine what we're aiming at much more vividly. Now this helps us also to be more informed, or at least it helps us to inform ourselves about what it will take to reach this target, and that helps us to actually prepare technically for what we want to reach. So why do I think it's so important for string players to be aware of the role that setting positively and clearly defined expectations play in their practice and their playing? I think that so much of what we do as string players is physical, that we tend to focus so much on the physical and the mechanical sides of playing when we're practicing. We often think of technique really in terms of mechanical stuff. Even when we talk about playing, we use terms like muscle memory, and we forget that the important thing about playing an instrument fluently is having the mental control over these aspects of playing. It's important to realize that we often default to negatively defined expectations when we're practicing without even realizing it. Now this has a negative impact on how we learn it leads to inefficient practice strategies, and it contributes to a negative relationship, I think, with one's own playing. Ultimately, if this aspect is completely ignored, it could lead to a feeling of not being in control of one's own playing. It could feel like the instrument is playing you instead of you playing the instrument. So what are the pros of setting clearly defined expectations and positively defined expectations, and actually managing those expectations when reaching for a goal? Well, first of all, I think one of the benefits is developing this mental control over technical aspects. I think it can help us develop more fluency and flexibility in our technique. It also leads to more security, and ultimately it leads to a feeling of trust. It builds trust in our ability, which is so important when we walk on stage and have to perform. Now, I want to illustrate what I mean by all of this by sketching two scenarios where I'll demonstrate how setting and managing expectations come into play in the practice process. So in scenario A, I want to play an octave shift on the G string from A to A. Now, I am a little bit scared of the shift. I'm not sure that I can do it. It's quite a far distance to travel. It's on the G string. I don't think I've practiced this enough. I don't know if I can play it. I hope I don't play it out of tune. So now, with all of those expectations, let's try and play the shift. Now, might not be a big surprise, but the shift was out of tune. So let's go over what happened. My expectation was that the shift probably wouldn't work. I was hoping that it would not be out of tune, but it was out of tune. So I have confirmed a negative self-belief. I have confirmed the fact that I probably can't play this shift because I didn't do it properly. I sort of failed at it. Now, on a conscious level, I might have heard, oof, this note was out of tune. But on a subconscious level, I'm not at all disturbed by this out of tune note. Because remember, my subconscious was literally expecting the result we just got. I wasn't expecting an in tune shift. So this means that the subconscious is not really interested in what's going on. My senses are sort of dulled. I've already set up a negative kind of feeling, an idea of failure. So this reinforces a negative self-belief, and it has a negative impact on learning. So let's go back to the practice model that I described in the beginning. We're now at the third step where we have to evaluate the gap between the reach and the target. Now, because I haven't clearly defined my target, it is actually quite difficult for me to evaluate that gap, because I'm not really sure exactly where it was that I was aiming at. So this slows down the practice process, and it's inefficient, and it's actually quite draining. So in scenario B, I'm going to attempt the same shift, but this time I'm going to have different expectations. My expectations will be that the shift will be perfectly in tune. I will hear the A string ring when I reach the top note. The octave interval will be absolutely pure. I will make a deep sound. The shift will be passionate. Before I attempt this, already I have a different I have a different mindset, because I have very clear goals now, very clear targets that I'm working towards, so I can prepare myself. I can prepare the kind of sound that I want. I can think of what the left hand has to do to achieve that very specific shift that I want. Okay, so now we try. So that was obviously also out of tune and with not a very good sound. But how is this attempt different to the first version, to scenario A? Well, first of all, the result, this failed attempt, didn't reinforce any negative ideas I had about my own playing. Secondly, the result is literally surprising and almost shocking. It startles my subconscious, because my subconscious was expecting a perfect shift. So this is a good thing, because it means that immediately our senses are heightened, our ears, our fingers, our muscles, everything is at a higher level because something unexpected has happened. In addition to that, this failed attempt now provides us with a lot of useful and valuable information. So when we evaluate this gap between the target and the result, because we have such a clear target, and because we know exactly what we wanted to do, it's much easier to make adjustments and to calibrate what we set out to do in the next attempt. Now, just as a final example, I might try and play the shift again with the same mindset, and let's see what happens if it works this time. Now, in this attempt, I've reinforced a positive belief about my own playing. I've reinforced the idea that I am capable of playing that shift. Now, that positive reinforcement triggers the release of endorphins, which means that in the long run, we get addicted to these little successes. We literally get addicted to playing in tune or to playing with a good sound. And that makes the whole practice process a lot more positive and rewarding. So those are just my thoughts on this topic. I really hope you found it interesting and that you could maybe try it out in your own practice or your own playing, even your own teaching. So thank you for listening.